Good evening, everybody. Welcome to Rose City Politics. It is December the 30th of 2020. We thought that last week was going to be our last episode of the year, but we decided that we'd come to you with one last one with an annual year in review. We're going to take a look at all of the biggest news stories of 2020. I'm sure some of you can think of some of the big ones right now off of the top of your head. We're still doing this show on Zoom. But we'll get to that in a bit. Our regular panel tonight includes Pat Papadeus. Pat, where are you coming from tonight? How are you?
I will not disclose where I'm coming from, but you can see I have a nice fire going. Yeah,
How was your holidays? How are you doing?
it was really nice. It was really, really nice. Of course, it was very small, and you know what? I didn't mind it at all. I know that I sometimes feel guilty because I'm kind of I think I was okay. I'm okay with being locked down and not doing a lot of things. So I know it's not as easy for everyone. I got to see my loved ones through Zoom, and so we're all good. We're all here. We're all still safe, and that's the main thing, right?
Absolutely. Keeping safe, having those smaller, quieter holidays, not the worst thing. There could be things that are a lot worse, especially during these times. So, look for the good where it comes. Doug, how are you doing? Where are you coming from? How are your holidays?
I'm coming to you from the New Year's celebration in the classic film Strange Days, and my holidays are going pretty good. Very, very chill. Much like Pat, it's been a long and busy and crazy year, so I'm taking the opportunity to slow it down into first gear, and I'm really enjoying it
Good to hear. I've never seen the movie. Do you recommend it?
highly.
Yeah. Okay. I'll take a look into it. I'm John Lidke. I'm coming to you live. I'm outside of Windsor City Hall tonight doing a remote hit. Glad to be here. It's a little chilly, but I've got a sweater on, so I'm okay. We have a guest panelist with us tonight, Manny Paiva, former news director of AM 800 and CTV Windsor. How are you, Manny? It's been a while.
Happy holidays, everybody. Thank you for having me back. It's great. I love the invitation and can't wait to chat about the crazy year of 2020.
It has been a crazy year. We want to thank all of our Patreon subscribers for sticking with us throughout it. I think we gained a couple too over the course of it, which is good. We didn't lose anyone, and I'm sticking with that. But we didn't actually lose anyone. So it's been a really good year for us on that front. We also want to thank Leuna625 for their kind support, not only in supporting Rose City Politics, but also in building better communities. So head to patreon.com/Rose City Politics. If you haven't, though, subscribe there. We are going to get right into this show. The year of hell, 2020. It brought with it a lot of unexpected downs, further downs, and even lower bottomless pits is what it felt like. I think the best analogy that I heard for it was the 13-minute clock, I believe. Was it, Doug, the 13-minute clock from Battlestar Galactica?
33.
33-minute clock.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's what this year has been like. Just non-stop shit show being thrown at you. It hasn't been enjoyable. We've all sought out, some of the highs that there have been, though. But Manny, I want to give you the first crack at taking a look at what you think are some of the biggest stories that hit us here locally in Windsor, Essex. What comes to the top of your head?
Well, of course, you have to start with the pandemic. I think everybody's going to talk about that, but there are so many different storylines with the pandemic, whether you want to call it coronavirus or COVID-19. But you talked about the biggest thing that I think has impacted Windsor and Essex County as a whole is the border closure and the impact that has had with regards to the travel across the border, limiting it to essential travel only, the impact on healthcare workers, both on this side and the other side of the border, the impact on tourism and the economy as a whole and how that functions. Of course, there are a couple of other stories that I think come to mind in 2020 when not talking about the pandemic, and it's difficult not to talk about the pandemic in this year, but I think there are two stories that stand out too, that are not pandemic related, and that is the loss of 2,000 jobs at the Chrysler plant with regards to the elimination of the third shift at the FCA. And I think a decision by the Windsor Police Services Board for its officers to start to carry naloxone, something that has been discussed quite frequently in the local market. And that has to do, of course, with the huge issue with regards to the drug problem, not only in Windsor's core, but in Windsor and the outlying communities as a whole. Everybody knows, I think it's been discussed in the media that everyone should know that the Windsor Police Service was the last major police department in Canada to make this decision to have its officers carry naloxone kits. And I think some people will argue that it's been long overdue, yet I don't think any of the officers are carrying naloxone kits as we discuss this topic right now at the end of the year 2020.
Yeah, as I understand it right now, it's just the detention unit officers that have been equipped, and the police services said that they would anticipatedly have their problem-oriented policing unit as well as the new city center patrols equipped by the end of 2020. So we'll maybe find out tomorrow if they've done that. I would presume, though, that if they had equipped it, there would have been a bit of some public notice about that. So that's going to be a story we're going to have to dig into as well next year to see where that rollout is. And yeah, you're absolutely right. We were one of the last ones in the province. And that, again, one of those statistics about Windsor being number one that you don't want to necessarily see. Pat, what do you think, just off the top of your head? What's the top news story that, from your perspective?
Right. I agree with Manny for sure. They're pretty well pandemic related. And in fact, how we've adapted, adjusted, pivoted. And that would be like, it's not one story, but sort of across the board, how organizations adapted and what they did. And of course, the big one being our response from a public health perspective. I think if I could put a thread through all of that, we are a political talk show. So when you take a look at the political angles, I see, and something we talked about a little bit last week, which is we're seeing a more politicized mayor's office. And this can be seen sort of early on from the start of the pandemic, from March on, after he returned, of course, when we had the shutdown of transit, the only major city to do that. And then ultimately, I think the big story is, and interestingly enough, just recently in the Windsor Star, there was sort of a bigger piece, almost a biographical piece, if you will, focusing on Dr. Ahmed. But I thought that the biggest sort of local component to that was the very relatively early on in both David Mouget, the release of the emails, if you recall, and the mayor stepping in, and the criticism of Dr. Ahmed and what's happened since. So I think those would sort of be some of the things. I think unrelated, I think everything is related to, however, of course, to the fact that we're in a pandemic, but surprisingly, the level of investment that nonetheless is coming, that we're seeing in the rejuvenation of the market in terms of homes and the development that we're seeing. Coming from a BIA perspective, I think that, I take a look at how businesses have pivoted. In fact, the BIAs and their responses to the ever-changing requirements and, different levels of lockdown that we've experienced, and organizations, particularly, if I may plug the downtown BIA, being able to, the patios that went out in the summer, the ability to do whatever businesses could to respond and keep safe. Including most recently a petition that is going out, so continued advocacy to make sure that the province gets it right in terms of not necessarily what's happening in gray zone, but even in gray zone. And as we know, the reality of when we have to transition out. So the investments in the core, responses by organizations and businesses, I think are really noteworthy stories.
Year of the pivot, you could also call this year, 2020. I think it's interesting, and I'm going to get to you, Doug, because I don't want to get into my stuff here, but you brought up the politicization of the mayor's office, Pat. And one of the things that is on my list when I went through putting together this for the show was the new chief of staff, and we'll get to that. And I wonder if there is a through line between, this new chief of staff and this completely different politicized office. I think obviously the answer is going to be yes, but we'll leave a little tack there in that. Doug, how about yourself? What comes to mind off the top of your head?
Before I get to that, I just want to mention that for our Patreon subscribers, there was a show that we did right around the time that Teleszewski became chief of staff, an after show for subscribers only. That was, and we talked about that for about 20 minutes. And I think if you go back and listen to that conversation and think about it in the context of how things have played out, it's quite interesting. Just a little plug for our Patreon. In terms of top stories, for me, and I agree with much of what's been said, but for me, when I look at the impact of the pandemic on our local region, I think that you have to look at the story around migrant workers. You have to look at because there are so many threads there: national politics, international politics, local politics. And I also think that it exposed, like many other things in this pandemic did, it exposed some challenges that we maybe don't like to talk about all the time, and some things that are lingering and long-term issues that we have to deal with as a community. And the pandemic exposed it. And I think in the case of the situation of migrant workers, and some of the challenges that they face, not only in terms of the risk of the pandemic, but also in terms of being concerned about their ability to return to work in future years, and all of those things. To me, that's one that has a lot of impact this year, and also has I think gives us a lot to think about for the future. Similarly, I think that long-term care, the impact of the pandemic on long-term care has exposed some issues and challenges that are long-standing, and there are a lot of really smart people who've said a lot of really smart things, I think, about what has gone wrong and what can be done. And that's something that I hope will continue to be a conversation even as we come out of the pandemic. In terms of non-pandemic related stories, it's really hard to think of too many things that didn't in some way touch the pandemic. But I think that, again, in terms of impact today and risk and challenge for the future, the unfolding situation with housing in the city of Windsor and in the broader county as well is a huge story. We had stories this year about people sleeping in cars. We had stories this year about rising rents. And we also have stories this year about the incredible demand for real estate, and the boom, the real estate boom, both in terms of value and in terms of housing starts in our community. So that's to me, that's a really interesting issue that I'm not sure that I've seen anyone politically really grapple with that whole big picture and articulate a vision for how we are going to be different in 2040 in terms of access to housing, in terms of affordability of housing. I don't know that I've heard anyone articulate that yet, and that conversation is sorely needed and sorely needs to continue.
That is a really interesting divide there, Doug, because looking back over the course of the year, some of the biggest stories that we focused on had to do with either the mission or with homelessness, and the situation, the need for more services just at its base level. And then, as you said, with that intense demand at diversifying our downtown residential core, as well as with the old Grace site. And it's just outside of COVID, you wouldn't think that those two things would be the biggest stories, but that divide between the two of them, it's not really a divide so much as it is the through line between the two. And yeah, it's an interesting perspective. I agree with pretty well everything that's been said. It's tough to not think of anything that's been touched by COVID this year as, making a bigger impact, of course, than what COVID has done. The biggest thing for me, though, I was reading on Boxing Day, as one of us would do, from Rose City Politics, going through the city of Windsor's response to the 1918 Spanish flu pandemic, and came across the fact that our Board of Health, as it exists today, found its inception as a result of the 1918 Spanish flu. And in 1919, a request was made from our region down here to Queen's Park to amalgamate the 5 townships that was Windsor, and the broader region into one board of health for the entire region that is now Windsor and Essex. And I find that to be incredibly interesting because we started this year with conversations before COVID about how Premier Ford is looking to amalgamate our regional board of health with 6 other boards of health. And I started thinking about how different our response would have been to this pandemic if our decisions weren't being made by Dr. Ahmed here in Windsor, Essex, but rather a regional administrator up in London who might not necessarily know what it's actually like here on the ground, because they are talking about what they had approved closing this office and creating an amalgamated one. So I think it's fortunate that these changes didn't go through this year, because as we saw with the fight between Dr. Ahmed and David Mouche over at Windsor Regional Hospital, I think having that autonomous role at our local medical officer of health was really important throughout this year. We saw that repeatedly, and I think that he should be. We don't have an award for it, but I think Dr. Ahmed should get the Hero of the Year award from Rose City Politics at the very least. But let me go through this year for us, and we'll dive into this a little bit. In January, when we started things off, you might remember nominations opened up for the Ward 7 by-election. That was scheduled for April 27th. It didn't occur until October 5th. Let's just really quickly, Doug, Pat, you guys know the political scene far more than I do from being involved in it. We talked about this way back, but what's it like to have had to see that kind of such a shift? Really quick though, Doug.
So the by-election was interesting because it was on, and we kind of knew, the deadline passed. We knew who all of the candidates were. Then it was frozen. Then there was the debate about whether or not to canvass during a pandemic. And some candidates made the choice to canvass. Some candidates made the choice not to canvass. Then we had to ask, when is this by-election going to happen? And it finally happened early October. So that was a pretty intense campaign period for a by-election. Now, normally in a scheduled election year, in the general election, candidates for municipal office will often start to get organized in January, February, but really the meat of the campaign doesn't start until August, September, October. So for these candidates, they were not only trying to find ways to get their name out there and engage, but also grapple with a pandemic. So I actually thought that the Ward 7 by-election was really fascinating to watch, and I can tell you that I took a lot of lessons away from it in terms of what campaigning would be like and should be like under these conditions.
I agree. I think that it was interesting to see how campaigns decided to campaign. I felt that there were a lot of missed opportunities given the amount of time. It looked like a lot of them sort of took a pause, because there was a delay on when the date was, and I found that a lot of them did not decided to really lay low during that period of time, which was very, very strange. You would think that they would take an opportunity. To be honest, I thought, and this is going to, this is where I get all the emails, but I thought it was a generally weak field. A lot of people running, but overall a generally weak field. This is not to take anything away from Jewin Gill, who was ultimately elected in that ward. And maybe, there were, some. But considering it was an open seat, a solid sort of position for the outgoing, somebody who had been elected to higher office, that seat had been taken. When you take a look at that seat, it's led to other things in other places, in a very sort of popular seat. And I thought that the talent that we saw there wasn't as up to par, really, as we should be seeing in when a seat is up for grabs, because this sort of gives us the landscape of leadership and people willing to put their name forward in public office. and I'm specifically talking about at the municipal level. And I think we constantly need to take a look at, we talk about, diversification. And we take a look at, who is around that table, and the voices that are around that table. And I think that in many ways, we need to still develop a lot of talent, of folks who want to be public servants in that sense, and seek higher office, and for what reasons, and why they're doing it. So it was a really interesting one to watch.
Yeah.
Being a voter in Ward 7, I found it very interesting to watch. I had three of the 12 candidates actually canvass in my neighborhood. And I spoke to three of them. And in the end, we could I will dub Mr. Gill a career candidate in various elections who won it all. But I would agree with Pat that I didn't think that the field was very strong at all. Were there maybe four legitimate of the 12 candidates that really provided an option for the voters in Ward 7? Maybe I'm being too nice in saying that there were four.
Interesting perspective. From the media perspective, Manny, I'd love to get your opinion as to just what do you think that the candidates, did they react well to trying to get into the media sphere? And then secondly, from trying to, I guess, if you had to have covered it from that perspective, what would have been like trying to cover something that should be very traditionally shorter, but over such a long period of time? Do you just chuck it off and wait until it gets to the sort of last minute and start talking about it, or?
Yeah, from a media perspective, the candidates and their platforms got buried because of the pandemic storylines, whether it be the issues taking place with the migrant workers, whether it be the issues with regards to the border, long-term care. The by-election was an afterthought, and trying to get information and the platforms from the candidates. I did not really see that from the media parties. I think maybe a week before the actual by-election vote, we saw some media publications with regards to who are the candidates, what do they stand for. We didn't hear a lot of that before, and I think it was a little bit too late. I think there were a couple of candidates who sought more attention, who wanted more attention by taking it upon themselves to contact the media and discuss certain issues in the ward. But for the most part, I found that many of the candidates did not do that, and therefore the coverage was lacking from a media perspective.
I agree with Manny. I should also add that I think I think back, and this is probably true 5 years from now, if you ask me what media story I do remember throughout that campaign, it was focused on an also ran down at the bottom of the list, who probably got way more votes as a result of it, but who really had no chance of winning. And yet a lot of attention is started as a sort of a social media story, and then mainstream media sort of picked it up and made it the story, was on the racist homophobe who was running. How does that serve the voters of Ward 7, in any way? And so that was also really interesting. That I think is an indication that there wasn't anything to really grab a hold of in terms of anybody really talking about the issues. And I think it is hard to talk about the issues that are specific to the ward. And frankly, how many are there? In like this is not to be down on that, but there aren't that many when you think about. So, but I didn't see anyone capitalizing on the strength of what they would bring around the city council table, to add to the sort of the fortitude of the importance of our municipal government, and the people that sit around the table to make really important decisions, and being part of that. I really didn't see that narrative coming out at all.
I just want to pick up on that and maybe ask Manny for his perspective on this, because that story that you're talking about, the story about the candidate in Ward 7, that was created on social media, and it was, in my opinion, and I think I have good reason to believe this, it was AstroTurf. It was social media campaign that was started by a fake Twitter account. And I think that Twitter account was probably connected to one of the campaigns in Ward 7. And what is interesting about it to me, and what I really want to hear your perspective on, Manny, is that the extent that social media buzz drives the media agenda. Um, it's really dangerous in an environment like Windsor, where we don't have a whole lot of prominent voices on social media. We and we the level of activity that it takes to characterize something as social media buzz is pretty limited. And this one was a story that rightfully angered and inflamed a lot of people and got a lot of people voicing their strong opinions. And I connect it to one of the other stories that I think really got its start on social media, and that was the anti-mask stuff. And then we saw the coverage of the anti-mask stuff, I think, probably all out of proportion to the real level of activity of these folks in our community, but again, generated on social media. So, Manny, do you think I'm out to lunch, or do you think that that's a risk for local media?
I think it's definitely a risk for local media. I think media in general, newsrooms in general, whether it be a newspaper, television, radio station, they like to say, we want to cover the stories that people are talking about. And if everybody opens their Facebook feed in the morning and this Facebook story appears with regards to a homophobic candidate or what have you, that's what people are talking about. So therefore, the media is going to start talking about that. And it is a dangerous thing, because in the end, I can tell you, at least from my perspective and some of the other people that I spoke to in Ward 7, that issue did not resonate. They wanted to know about how is council and this new candidate going to support flooding in the community and try to stop flooding in the community. How are they going to improve safety, whether it be a new stop sign, traffic lights, speed bumps, what have you in the community. This was the topic, I think, as you mentioned, Doug, was created just to gain attention for this one candidate, negative attention for this one candidate. But in the end, even though the media jumped on top of it and it was a good topic, it did not resonate with voters. And I think the other perspective why the media jumped on that is because of what we saw also in 2020 with the Black Lives Movement, especially south of the border, and it brought up the ugly realities of racism in Canada. So this was a Windsor connection to that ugly reality of racism that sort of gripped the country at that time as well.
Interesting perspective with that. So you would say though, like, you don't think that it torpedoed the candidate's chances at all? Like, were residents in Ward 7 still interested in what he had to say, or was it like, or just was it a complete wash?
No, I still think the candidates were interested in what the candidate had to say, but on their main issues with regards to, are you going to provide funding so I can fix my house so that my basement doesn't flood, for example? Are you going to improve safety in my neighborhood? I think if the candidates talked more about that, we might have seen a different race or maybe a different result. Granted, I found the field, it was again watered down, wasn't very strong. There were 12 candidates too, so it was split. I think there were a number of factors that way, but I think the people, the voters in Ward 7 were looking for more meat and potatoes, if you will. And they did not get that from any of the candidates in my mind.
Thank you. The other issue that I had, I don't really want to talk about it too much or really at all, but just bring it up. The fact that Mayor Dilkins unilaterally entered into supposed preliminary partnership talks with Amazon Ring Network. We heard about that. There hasn't been a follow-up to it. Since then, we've had conversations and we've seen throughout the year that there's been a lot of issues with this type of technology, the artificial intelligence that's used by it, and racial profiling that comes from it. The fact of feeding it all into police networks is a concern as well. So that was one of those weird ones that really came out of left field. It has huge implications to be feeding this into that public network, and we haven't heard anything about it. So that was a weird one for me that popped up. But looking at February, we saw one of the bigger stories, and I'm surprised that it didn't come up when I asked you guys about it at the outset. The city council had approved a 2.1% tax increase. And that's a big deal here in Windsor. We hadn't seen something like that in a while. Doug, do you think that it broke through in the same way that it would, like, would it still be on the top of people's minds at this point in the year as it was if without COVID, I guess?
So I think managing expectations around tax increases has been probably a success for the mayor over the last few years. I think that he has effectively, and I was really curious about this because we knew that the tax freeze or the spending freeze could not continue forever. And I was really curious to see how this was going to play out. I think that what Mayor Dilkins has tried to do over the course of this term is frame it as moving from a tax freeze to increases at the rate of inflation, and that's kind of the new target. And because he has effectively, I think, moved the standard of success to being, keeping things in line with inflation. It had way less impact than you might have thought in the middle of the tax freeze era, or even at the end of the tax freeze era. If you had said Drew Dilkins is going to become mayor and he's going to raise taxes by over 2%, I think that you would have thought that that was going to be a real political liability for him, but I don't think it has been at all. I think there's a general sense in the community that, and maybe I'm going too far in saying that, but I think there's a general sense in the community that the tax freezes were more than were needed, and that the tax freeze lasted longer than it needed to. So it's, I think it's pretty much where it should be now in terms of the debate. I think that the having the debate be centered on should we freeze taxes at zero or freeze spending increases at zero or not, makes it really very difficult to talk about any investments in the community. Now that the debate has moved to a little bit of a different plane where we're now talking about inflationary increases, I think that creates more room to have a more robust conversation.
Pat, I want to throw it to you, but before we do that quickly, my perspective on it is that Mayor Dilkins was handed a gift here in the sense of, I mean, we're going to be looking at taxes probably going up far more than inflation over the next couple of years due to this pandemic. So the slate has effectively been wiped clean. The memory of him instituting the 2.1% increase could almost just be, merged into the background of, the pandemic and there's all this new spending. Do you think that's going to have any impact on it? And conversely, Doug's saying that you might have this conversation about increased taxes. I don't know. I think there might be an appetite to go and hold the line again once this whole thing is over and done with, whenever that may be. What's your perspective?
I don't think so. I agree with you that I think that looking back on it, few people are going to remember it, and it's interesting that we didn't even hit it because it's. You're absolutely right. I think that the pandemic has certainly overshadowed that, but I agree with Doug. Without having any data to sort of back this up, I think the community was actually, I think you would have seen a backlash had they decided to hold the line one more time, because I think that over the years, because don't forget, this started under the administration of the previous mayor and was a holdout. And then there was a renewal, I think, on council, and you were not going to see that happen anyway with this council, which is more progressive. And frankly, as a result of that, they were able to make a very clear line and a connection between, it's not, between services, what you get in services, and your investment in those services, and what you're cutting as a result of holding the line. Because if you're not keeping up with rate of inflation, you have to take away from something. And so I think people started to get that connection. And I saw even the most fiscally conservative saying, you know what, keeping up with inflation is actually okay, because you're going to end up paying sooner or later. You know, we talk about not being able to keep up with the maintenance of things. Well, what happens when you don't keep up with the maintenance of things is that eventually you're going to end up paying a lot more. So it actually doesn't make fiscal sense. So I think it moved to a place where it should have gone. And I think the people, I agree with Doug, that they were ready for it. And to some extent, some acknowledgement on the mayor's part. I think he had to realize that that it had to go that way, but he did manage it well.
Manny, what's your take on, the budget, how it rolled out and where we're at and where we're going?
I'm really interested to see how next year's budget will look like and the impact on taxes that way. I agree with Pat and Doug's comments that they could not hold the line in 2020. They needed to bring in some sort of tax increase. And I think the mayor did do a good job of tying it to the rate of inflation. But I'm interested to see what type of increase, because I believe there will be an increase in 2021, but what type of increase that will be and how much the pandemic will play into that, whether it be from the mayor's office and the phrasing that they use with regards to the pandemic and the types of increases in spending that we will see in the budget.
I'm glad to see the hold the line gone. I can speak from experience. Over a decade ago, when I was on the Mayor's Youth Advisory Committee, just a young kid, I remember having to sit in one of the clerk's offices going through our budget and being told you need to cut 10% from your budget, and learn the inner workings of how municipal politics works from a $7,000 annual budget for the Mayor's Youth Advisory Committee, and trying to figure out, like, what do we cut? Honestly, we don't spend that much, and then being told, no, you have to make sure that you spend everything, but then you got to cut that 10% because otherwise they'll cut even more of it next time. It's just like, so this is how it works. This is
Well, so not to interrupt you, sorry. I mean, it's not the way it necessarily has to work. It just happens to be that. Like, that's a whole other conversation
yeah.
of when you do look at how you can either hold the line or not, not get to an increase, a number that you don't think is palpable. But how do you do that? And there's certainly a lot more conversation to be had about whether you sort of send it across all administrative bodies across the organization and say you have to arbitrarily find 10% without actually taking a look at and aligning a budget with priorities. So I agree with Manny. I think that it's going to be interesting to see, but I also think we're going to be seeing a lot more advocacy or politicizing, if you will, in terms of the flow of dollars from different levels of government and what that looks like. And that's going to get a whole lot more complicated and interesting to watch.
Yeah, just
what its responsibility is in this regard. Yeah.
Absolutely. On that note, the Windsor Essex County Health Unit, their budget, they've been spending, and there is a big gap now that's going to have to be made up. And we've seen Councillor Bordelin publicly advocating on social media, saying the province needs to step up. This money needs to flow down from the ministry. We can't be relying on ourselves, or else, that inflationary increase is going to be a lot more than just inflation. Going on from there, we saw the Windsor Public Library sale. We saw the downtown mission, and the outcome of that sale and a new sale. We saw Councillor Bordelin publicly telling the community writ large, don't donate to this organization if they're doing these kind of actions. That, to me, was probably one of the biggest stories. Seeing one of our assets flipped, seeing one of Windsor's biggest community assets just flipped, blew me away. Pat, I want your perspective on this one first.
Well, and then of course you're talking about really early on, and then so that was a big development, and then there was another development, and now there's another development. So that story hasn't, of course, gone away, and it's one that we're going to be revisiting in some shape or form. In 2021, notably, where is the mission going to go? What is the mission going to do? I've been very vocal about this particular issue for a number of reasons, but I do think, and there's a number of places that we can see that sometimes our city does not negotiate well. And this is an example where certainly it could be said that, when they took a look at the who they were negotiating with and what was being negotiated, and the fact that they wouldn't have recognized the negative public reaction to selling off of the library, but also the location of saying it's okay to move the mission onto Ouellette Avenue, frankly, which would not have solved any of the current problems that we have with the mission's current location, and in fact exacerbated those. That was certainly an interesting story, and I think that it's not over, because we keep hearing different things. And then there was the flip and the property, and now there's some discussions of being of where it might go. I do think last week we rated the councillors and the mayor. We scored them, and I graded Reno Bordelin Ward 3 City Councillor very high. I think overall he rated the highest collectively for us, and there's a lot of reason. Even till now, here's the name that's come up several times. I mean, Manny mentioned the change by the Windsor Police Services and the carrying. What has changed? I think I honestly think it's because Reno Bordelin is on the police board now. So it's really interesting, his impact and the impact that he's had. But in that particular issue, I have to say that when I saw the story of him saying, "Don't donate to the mission," I have to say I cringed, and I'm like, why are you going there? I guess in part of me says, what we don't need, people don't need our politicians telling us where to give our disposable income and our charitable donations. That's one of my views. And I sort of hope that people have a better sense of being able to connect the dots and actually be very critical of where, just as critical as whether there's going to be a percentage increase in my taxes and where I demand my services to go. Even more so for where I honestly choose to give my charitable donation. And yet it was interesting that in retrospect, I think that it overall served the issue very well. It elevated to the point where people actually started to question it. Although I didn't agree with him making the statement at the beginning, I thought that, sometimes we, with all due respect, overestimate people's ability to make these connections. And it was one that he sort of hammered, and it was well done, because I think what ended up happening when we fast forward that issue and we take a look now that they're talking about this other location on McDougall and Shepherd and the plans, that would not have happened that did not happen from the board of the mission sort of stepping up saying, "We've heard, we listen, and we've got another plan." That came with a lot of pressure, frankly, from very major donors. And so I thought that was an important piece of what happened later.
Yeah,
Doug,
I agree with that. And I too was curious whether that was gambit of asking people not to donate to the mission was going to turn out to be a wise one. But in the end, if you read the media reports about the new plans at the mission, the response to donor demands is all over those stories. So ultimately, I think it did work out. It did turn out to be a move that paid off. But the other thing about this story, Reno Bordelin is definitely one of the personalities in our community. We have lots of elected officials, but we only have so many personalities. And Ron Dunn is another one. Ron Dunn is a character. He's a person who does not shy away from talking into a microphone when he's up, when he's down, when things are going good, doesn't matter. He's always there. He's always ready to defend himself, and always ready to defend himself in provocative terms. So that makes for a dynamic when you have two people who are willing to go to the edge in their comments from time to time. And that conflict that played out in the media, I thought was not only really interesting, but also probably made great fodder for news stories.
well, he's a former media man himself, right? So he knows
True.
how to speak and he knows how to get coverage. Manny, what's your take on the mission story? I mean, we've been talking about it nonstop ourselves.
And it's not done yet. I think that's the one thing that sticks out to me is the story is not done. But I found that Reno Bordelon is one of those council members, in my opinion, that he will tell you, you will be able to tell his level of frustration from his words. And this was one story where you could tell he was really frustrated um, by the fact that this city-owned asset that they were going to give to the downtown mission or sold to the downtown mission was no longer going to be used to the downtown mission, and he did not know what was going to transpire from that afterwards. And I don't think there's enough council members in Windsor that will tell you what they're truly feeling or their level of frustration. If they're feeling a level of frustration, I think there's maybe two or three that you could really tell that they will not be shy about what they feel, about what they're frustrated about. And in this case, I think it's a breath of fresh air. And I think people want to hear from the counselors that way if they're upset about something. And in this case, Reno Bordelon was upset about something.
Yeah, got to agree with that. And Doug, I really like your perspective that there's only so many personalities in Windsor. At the Windsor Independent, we used to joke that there's only 10 to 15 Windsorites, and they always just pop up here or there, and you'll see them on all the different photos. And it's just, you can think about it right now if you're listening right now. Who do you think your 10 Windsorites are that come to mind that are always out there? Let us know in the comments for this show. The other thing I wanted to say, we'll talk about it later on before we get to October, but Manny, as you mentioned at the outset, Chrysler ended its third shift in February. Huge story, but we'll talk about that when it's coming back for the investment story when we get to that. And then a quick joke that I want to make, just a little bit of a glib one. In February, we also saw the DWBIA stop sponsoring two parades, the Canada Day Parade and the Santa Claus Parade, both of which very different this year because of COVID in 2020. So, Pat, what did you know and why didn't you tell us?
We were talking about that when we were looking at, as a BIA, when we were looking at what do we do under these circumstances? Of course, we'll probably get to it, but the decision not to have the bright lights at Jackson Park and the investment, first time and probably maybe only time investment into the BIAs by the mayors of the city, and what to do with that. And of course, the changing levels. So we actually had this conversation going, hey guys, do you remember when we canceled the parades? Wasn't that sort of,
but before COVID,
right? Oh yeah, well before, and under a great deal of, sort of reaction, if you will remember.
You could have waited a month and a half and had no pushback.
And basically said exactly, we don't really have a choice, but that's okay. That's where leadership comes in. That's where we stood. It was a good decision then. And maybe it'll be like the mayor's tax increase, if you will. Nobody will remember why.
So we're going to move on to March, and we'll focus March on the mayor's office. But outside of that, we saw the glimpses at downtown intensification. Again, we saw more and more examples of that coming forward. We also saw Canada closing the border with the United States in March, but we saw a new chief of staff in Mayor Dilkin's office that was announced. At the same time, we saw Mayor Dilkins trapped in Jordan, which was, again, I still can't get over the fact that we lost our mayor for a little bit at the beginning of this pandemic. And then we also saw the mayor unilaterally shut down Transit Windsor. So let's use this as that time to talk about the politicization of the mayor's office, the changing face of the mayor's office, and strong decisions being made by the mayor himself. Doug?
So I do think that the change at chief of staff had an immediate and noticeable impact. The mayor's communication changed. Some of the things some of the focus of his attention seemed to change, and ultimately, we did talk about this when the change happened, and we had a lot of good things to say about Norma Coleman and the Norma Coleman era. But I think, given where Mayor Dilkins is at in his time in office, I think that it was a good move for him to make. to the extent that it was his choice to make it, and we don't know those details. But I do think that it was a good move to make, and I think overall, this hire has probably been more positive than negative. You can't talk about this without talking about the increasing level of sort of partisanship coming out of the mayor's office, and whether that is something that is being driven by Mr. Dilkins or whether that's advice he's being given, we of course can't know that. But the two things do seem to coincide, and we don't know what the causal relationship is. Did Mr. Dilkins become more interested in partisan matters for whatever reason and decide that this was the right chief of staff, or did this chief of staff come on board and subsequently Mayor Dilkins decided to be more partisan? But to me, those two things are linked. There are a lot of questions to ask about how they are linked, but they definitely, in my mind, are very linked. Shutting down Windsor Transit. I think, and I want to be measured in my comments, but I guess I'm not going to be. There are things that take political courage. When you have to do something that challenges the interest groups that got you there, when you have to do something that is the right tough call, even though it is maybe going to limit or make your own political future more difficult. And then there are the bullshit ones. There are the quote unquote tough calls that you make that are not going to hurt anybody that you care about, but are going to let you feel good, look decisive. And I really think that Mayor Dilkins made a bad call here. I think it was a terrible call. I think it was a decision that was made for political reasons. And in making that decision, a lot of the most vulnerable people in our community were harmed. And I really thought it was shitty.
Pat, I want to ask you your opinion on it, but Doug, Pat, and Manny, you think that the mayor's poems are linked to the new chief of staff? Yes or no? Across the board?
No, I
No?
don't.
Doug?
I think that the mayor has always had that little creative side to him. I've mentioned it before. I think he missed his calling as in broadcast. I think his mayor minutes, he are well done, and frankly, he's done a really it's probably one of his biggest strengths of this pandemic, and I think he's found a chief of staff who saw that and capitalized on it. Frankly, I just saw a recent one that he did of outtakes. I mean, I think that he does a good job of that. But again, that's window dressing, right? And so, that is, it's a connection, and I think he does a good job of that. So I don't want to be overly critical of something that's good, but when we get to the real issues that matter to people and have impact on our lives and the lives of people in our community, then we're back to having a very serious conversation about what that is. And I know Manny mentioned it. I know we're going to get to it because you're sort of going in chronological order here, John. And by the way, I think it's a really good setup, because there are many things that we may not have reached, and it's a very comprehensive approach, frankly. So thank you for setting it up that way.
Oh, you're welcome.
But,
thank you.
yeah, but we're going to get to Black Lives Matters and what happens in a couple of months that's going to be hit all of really it comes out of the United States, but impacts all of North America, and I think sort of attention around the world in terms of what is happening. And here's a very good example. I know we've gone how long right now into the program, and we have not mentioned a new hospital and location. Obviously, it was going to happen sooner or later, but let me draw that connection now with Windsor Transit and that hospital. We're going to see in a couple of months on this chronology that suddenly we're going to look to how can we make sure that we have more inclusive in the voices that are around the table. And then we're going to forget that we actually have a committee, not consult with them, form a new one, right? Like, I mean, this is like these things need expressing. Other institutions around our community in terms of how the issues are being handled. But at the end of the day, I think we recognize what comes out of that is that we have systemic issues, and we need changes at systemic levels to address those. That those are not, okay, put a few people together and it looks good, it's very colorful in a diagram, and in a visual, and then forget about it, right? Like, and so here's a really good example. Who was directly impacted the most by the shutdown of Windsor Transit? And frankly, who is going to be most negatively impacted by the proposed location of the hospital? This is where leadership really steps up, right? Like, this is where we make those connections. And I know, we're going to get to it, but for sure, a huge mark on the mayor on that one. But I also think it's also consistent with a certain level of privilege that we saw while he was away when the pandemic hit. That particular decision, I'll repeat it again. At one point, I think he tweeted that he's the first mayor to do so. It was kind of like looking back and realizing, if you're, but nobody's following. I wonder why that is. And then other issues as we move down in the chronology of the year, including, do what I say, but don't do as I do, going out for dinner and all those things. There's a certain level that is pretty clear. And I think Windsor Transit has a lot of those characteristics. Shutting down Windsor Transit has a lot of those characteristics.
Got to agree with you on that. Manny, I want your perspective on this issue, but also through the lens of the media and this politicization of the mayor's office and what access would look like in terms of these changes.
I don't think there was ever an issue with access for the media during this time.
Maybe for some.
Well, I don't think Mayor Dilkins has ever met a microphone he didn't like. So he is always going to make himself available and try to explain his positioning with regards to the decisions that he makes. So he is always going to make himself accessible, I think.
I think I just want to interrupt and push back just a little bit, Manny. There was a period of time where I don't think that the mayor was talking to CBC. And we've heard rumblings in other quarters about the mayor using access as a weapon. It has happened. I hear what you're saying, but I think he likes friendly microphones a lot.
We had to buy him a cake for his birthday at the Windsor Independent to even get an interview with him. It took a year.
I was going to say, except for the CBC, because I believe that there was a period of time where he was not speaking with the CBC. So, Doug, I agree with you on that point. But I think the mayor's office, and the Mayor Dilkins in particular, looks at the media with regards to where can he get the most bang for his buck, and he's very specific about who he talks to that way. I wonder, and Pat and Doug and John, maybe you can answer this. If that hospital was open at the new location, would he have shut down public transit during a pandemic?
Ooh, very good. Very good question. No, of course not.
Oh, I don't know about that. I don't know that he wouldn't have. He came back. First of all, it's such a hypothetical in that, I was, watched the city council meeting, and we'll eventually get to that. Maybe we'll be like a two-parter. We're going to get into the next year. But the meeting that city council had about sending the endorsement of the location to the premier, to move on, getting us to the next level and getting the funding. And I think this was questioning of Philippa, in fact, when she mentioned the transit plan and accessibility to this new location. And I remember the questioning, he turned into the, and don't you think that we could, are you saying that we can't get a bus out there, and that we can't be trusted to? And frankly, I was watching that going, yeah, actually, yes. I don't think why should we take it at your word that this is going to happen, that we should somehow trust that suddenly we're going to transform our transit system, and not only are they going to be bigger, better, and more efficient than ever, like, take what we have and imagine that it would be so much better to get to that location. I don't think there's anything on record, frankly, as despite the improvements that have happened, and the major, by the way, let me say, investments, which I think is also a huge story of the year, which is, correct me if I'm wrong, $18 million directly to transit from the federal government in during COVID, right? So talk about bad political decision making, thinking that he was kind of leading, and in fact nobody followed, and in fact, really where leadership would have come in would have been to take a look and say, this is a public service, this is what we're here for, to ensure that we have these things in place for the public, and just going immediately to shut it down. Frankly, Manny, I am not convinced that he wouldn't have done it for the hospital. And I think that there would have been a lot of reasons given and rationale around that.
Yeah, I think that's I gotta agree. People,
You're a little low, Doug, for me.
is that better?
Yes.
Okay. People lost access to healthcare services when transit was shut down this spring. Lots of people who needed to use transit to get to their healthcare jobs lost access, and that didn't create a barrier for Mayor Dilkins. And I know that he's a big proponent of this hospital, the new hospital location, but I don't think that would carry over into a reluctance to shut down transit service.
It's interesting. It's a hypothetical, as you mentioned, Pat, that we'll never know. But I wonder if because he is such a proponent of the new hospital, if that would have gone into his thinking at all.
It's an interesting hypothetical. It's a fun game. We should play more hypothetical games like this. I talked to Doug at the beginning of the year. I wanted to do fantasy city council with your candidate who lost, but go to them and see what their votes would have been and what the city could have looked like. But moving out of March, it'd be a fun game for for 6 or 7 of us in the city. Moving out of March, we saw retooling across, quite frankly, the province and the country for COVID-19 response. Locally, we saw Ford converting the Windsor engine plant to produce plastic face shields. That stuck out for me as a history major from University of Windsor. When you see the complete retooling of the society for a war type effort, you only hear those stories so often, once in a century, and to realize that we were living through one, that really stood out for me personally. And for those of you who are listening right now, I'm sorry that your mugs that you're only seeing are Doug and I right now, if you're on Facebook there. Moving right along into May and June, we saw the beginnings of the Black Lives Matter movement here in Windsor. Not the beginnings of it, but rather the response to international outcries for it and how that manifested here. We saw responses from the Windsor Police Service, the new chief of police, saying that there are issues that need to be addressed and that there will be a continual inward looking to address them. The mayor said that Windsor can do better as well, and we're going to continue talking about that. We'll get to it when we get to July, talking about the diversity committee chair saying how he feels ignored by the community. But in June, we saw, as mentioned at the outset, the fight between Windsor Regional Hospital's CEO, David Muji, and the Windsor Essex County Health Unit's Chief Medical Officer of Health, Dr. Ahmed, regarding authorizing EMS paramedics to perform COVID-19 testing, with Dr. Ahmed wanting to only focus on outbreaks, not asymptomatic spread. His justification and reasoning for that as the Chief Medical Officer of Health was we only had so many resources and they needed to be used as efficiently as properly. And I think it's borne out that he was probably on the right side of history on that one. And that was a really interesting one. It took CBC bringing out that 63-page FOIA, and it was a really quick turnaround on that FOIA as well. We talked about that on the show, whereas some freedom of information requests take years to get. That was one that seemed like it was pushed out in about 5.5 days, and there's ample time to talk about that as well. But I think that we're also going to want to talk about here Mexico halting the migrant worker flow following the uproar over the Essex County deaths that were seen. that made international news, obviously. And in June, we also saw the launch of the We Can't Wait $300,000 campaign by the Windsor Essex Economic Development Corporation in favor of the mega hospital. Manny, I want to start with you on your take of just June with these issues that I mentioned. But we go to Doug right now, and then we'll come back to Manny.
Manny's on mute, I think, that this issue.
Okay. Sure. So that's quite a pile of issues that you brought up there. Some of the I think the most interesting one to me is the media battle between the medical officer of health and the CEO of Windsor Regional Hospital. That was interesting to me because you could see from the media reports that there was a lot of background politics happening, but I don't know that it was ever quite clear what the objectives were, and what would constitute one side or the other winning. So I found that really interesting, and I think it kind of petered out for that reason, that it ended up being a bit of mudslinging and a bit of a sideshow. I don't know what the goals were, and I don't know if they were achieved, and I don't know that the general public ended up knowing that. That freedom of information request that you're talking about, I thought that was really quite interesting. You talked about the speed at which it was. At which it was performed, and that was surprising. And it makes you wonder. And I know we're talking about different entities. We presume that was a FOI request made of Windsor Regional Hospital, and there's no lower limit on how fast you can respond. But it does make you wonder about the difference between an organization that's motivated to get some information out and an organization that perhaps is dragging its feet. And the other question that I have about that is, who thought to issue that freedom of information request, and based on what information? That to me is the other piece. Is was that just a brainstorm in the middle of the night? We should really ask for the correspondence between the officer of health and the CEO of the hospital. I think that would be great. I don't know if that's a standard practice, but it seemed oddly specific to me.
Guys, I have to apologize. I had a unstable internet connection there, so I did not. If I disappeared there for a second, that's what was going on. But on that last point, Doug, my feeling is that somebody leaked something to the media, and that, or whether it be from the CEO's office or from the MOH's office, that somebody leaked something to the media and said, listen, this is the fighting that's going on behind the doors. If you think that it should be made public, this is what you should do, or I think my side is right, so therefore you should put in an FOI request and make this public. And I think that's what transpired with regards to the media getting that, or putting in the application for the FOI.
Yeah, I got to agree. It feels like it had to have been a leak. If that was something that was just brainstormed, kudos on thinking that, but it felt like a leak. It reads like a leak. Pat?
Yeah. Well, yeah, and I'm so and I think, who did the FOI? Because I think you said CBC, and my understanding was that it was actually the Windsor Star.
And I believe it was the Windsor Star.
I think it was Ann Jarvis. I think it was Ann Jarvis. And so when you take a look at that, so just going, assuming somebody gave a little bit of a gift to somebody to take a look at that, and in return say, hey, why don't you FOI this? Then given how the story was written, frankly, and the perspective that it came from, I don't think it was MOH, because there was nothing that would have benefited the ministry in terms of seeing sort of this internal local pissing match, frankly. And so I, all things kind of point to Windsor Regional Hospital and David Mouget.
You are right as well. I'm sorry, it wasn't CBC, it was Windsor Star who did the FOIA. And most interestingly, it was Ann Jarvis doing one of her news stories, not opinion stories, that it ran in on May 28th, which again, raises an interesting point. Was it leaked to get the opinion article? And then, Ann goes, wow, this is a lot meatier than just an opinion article here. This is a full blown news story. So I agree. It's an interesting topic for sure. We're getting low on time. It's been a busy year, so I'm gonna go through a couple months.
Okay,
And
but I do want to stress, I think, I mentioned at the top, I think that is because we are talking about some of the biggest news stories, and I think that is one of the biggest news stories. How that played out at that particular time, the circumstances around the media, the spin. There was a petition to remove Dr. Ahmed after that, if you remember. I think some of the and what that served to do, despite what we're seeing now and what we're seeing in terms of the leadership that came out of that office and Dr. Ahmed, was a real undermining of that particular office. And frankly, the intention to do so. I mean, there's no other reason to want to leak. Again, I don't, I can't speak, who leaked the story, whatever. We're speculating on that. But either way, what we had was the undermining of our chief medical officer in the region by politicians to some extent, but also the head of the hospital. So that to me was really, really important because it undermines confidence in the very the science, if you will. And we're going to see as COVID progressed and COVID fatigue and people's lockdown reached, right? All of that I think is connected because when you've had earlier your own sort of internal fights with the positions and the advice and the recommendations and the edicts, if you will, of the chief medical officer, well, then it's fair game, isn't it? And I thought that it was a very unfortunate situation that happened at that time. And I haven't actually heard anybody come out to make any apologies about that, frankly.
you're absolutely right, Pat. And I mean, undermining our medical officer of health at any time going after the office is, it's a big issue that would make a big news story at any time, let alone during a pandemic.
So, I'm just going to say this very quickly because I think people sort of, you're going to say, well, aren't you, isn't there times when you're going to disagree? So I want to be really clear. There's times to disagree about what the role is and where they should be, in terms of the chief medical officer and what their role is. And within their role, and this was within their role, right? Staying in the lane. I mean, there are times when we're going to see, sort of public advisory on, stores shouldn't sell cannabis or whatever. I don't even remember some of those issues. Well, you can talk about what you think the effects medically are of cannabis. That's a whole different story. You're sort of not in your lane if you're saying things need to shut down. So I think there is a nuance that people do need to understand. It's not that whatever any medical, chief medical officer, and this is true, locally, provincially, federally, et cetera. I think one of the things when you take a look at leadership, and not to go to a lot of different levels, but certainly there's a conversation happening right now provincially, because that's the one closest to healthcare delivery and services. And the reason why I have a fireplace behind me in terms of what's happening. And, we've got the science versus the politicians. And I think one of the things that has been done well is when our scientific and our medical community and are those responsible for that have been out front and center when the politicians have allowed them to be out. That is, to me, when I personally feel that as a citizen, I have the most confidence in those as much as possible evidence-based decision making, certainly based on the evidence that we have, the best evidence at the time. It's where politicians then take that information and try to create policy where we've seen that disconnect hasn't always happened. I think there's certainly room to be critical of the political decision making or public policy decisions as a result, if you know what I mean. I mean, again, going back to what Transit Windsor, let's not forget that's a big thing, right? The chief medical officer, in fact, and I thought that showed a lot of bravery as well, said that he did not agree. He would not have supported the mayor's decision to shut down transit. He did not think that was necessary. So there you go. There's an example of, that anyway.
Yeah. Oh, hey, thank you for that, Pat. Looking to July, we saw the city approving a $5 billion sewer master plan. Very big deal. We also saw businesses taking over the streets in the launch of what's been dubbed patio culture. I think it should have extended through to the winter, quite frankly, because I don't see why people wouldn't want to still go out in the winter, even if it's cold. Having that patio available would have been nice to have seen that as well. But really cool to see the city change so dramatically. Even though it's a result to COVID, I think a lot of us want to see that stay. I know that Pat, of course, would like to see that stay. We've talked about this on the show. I would love to see it stay as well.
If I
And
may, John, I'd like to just sort of address that very quickly, and I know we really want to move on, but I do want to say that I don't think that in fairness to city and administration, I don't think the reason that you saw those patios come down in the winter had to do with them necessarily, and that has more to do with snow removal and the impact that salt particularly would have on those. And so I think that there are some other sort of more practical reasons why they can't stay up, depending, I'm talking particularly about the extended patios, not necessarily the shutting down of sidewalks, etc. So I think that there are some real reasons why patios needed to come up during taken away during the patio season and then go back. So I just wanted to point that out. But I also, what was the other point that you made? There was something else.
sewer master plan.
No, it had to do with, I can't remember. Okay.
Okay, we'll move on.
Yep.
We also had mentioned that the chair of Windsor's diversity committee said that he feels ignored by the city. This is an issue that we've heard about before. It's an issue that hasn't been resolved, quite frankly, and it will be discussed again as we continue to move forward. In August, we spoke about this one a lot, but to bring it up, City Council unanimously waived $364,000 of taxes for Shmuel Fari's Holiday Inn Select after there was a lease that was signed with Windsor Regional Hospital. I think that's still an ongoing story with questions left lingering about how that happened, who sought it, and why it was necessarily approved. We saw Camp their leave to appeal of the rezoning rejected by Superior Court. That really put sort of, I guess, a pin on that challenge there. It was sort of exhausted to its final avenues. Camp still says they're looking towards other options to move forward with, but it's tough at this point to see, anything other than where the path that we're on. In September, this is the one that I do want to speak about, and Pat, I'll bring you in for this one. Windsor was ranked number 2 in the province, not in a good way, for lack of representation on council. And I will make aware that this was in September before the election, where there was, an opportunity to potentially see another woman on council be elected. That didn't occur. We have another male on council. We have a male who is of a ethnic minority, which adds to that diversity. But Pat, what's your take about the lack of representation here? Just, I want to have your input, obviously, just being a woman and it being a very male dominated field. It has been for a very long time.
Well, let me just confer with my vagina for a moment. Oh yes, okay. So this is what we think. I've said this before, and I don't think we should be looking at just raw numbers. I think numbers are an indication. I mentioned this last week when we did council scorecards. We have one woman on city council. I don't ever, with one exception, and it was frankly offensive. I don't remember our one female woman councillor actually raising issues, considering that Windsor in that term, in her many years of terms, has been the worst city to be a woman, in how many years in a row, and the issues that we really have to address. So I don't think, and I take a look at, we can go broader. We can go, on the national stage here, on the provincial stage. We can, look to our friends to the south to say, take a look. I don't think that it is so easy to say gender, color, etc. gets you to anything, right? These are not the kind of numbers that I want to see. And frankly, I think it's very difficult to see that kind of suddenly transition to a city council of, predominant. We have to take a look at the systemic issues and how elections are very different than other places of leadership in our communities and what diversity looks like. And frankly, that's where I think that our focus should be. I think we should be looking at diversity and representation and the voices around the table. And that doesn't just not include color and gender, but it also includes youth and age around our boards and committees, all boards of organizations. You said earlier, if we could take a look at the 15 personalities or 10 or 15 personalities, I've got another challenge. Take a look at, sort of the names that are continue to come up on boards and committees in our city, and the connections that those have, particularly at the high level. I think this is very problematic because there's that clique, and I belong to your board, you belong to my board, and then we're going to particularly in the high level not profit agencies in our community. So having said that, and that's where you see leadership, right? By being able to say, okay, here are the people that are parts of boards and committees. Now you're building that talent pool that I was talking about earlier. And maybe eventually those people are going to run for office, and we're going to see stronger candidates emerging as a result of that kind of leadership. I don't think you're going to have one ward. So for example, in the last board election saying, oh, let's take a look at city council, not enough women, let's make sure it's a woman. I don't think voters vote that way, and they don't see that kind of picture. Now, we ended up with a person of color in Juin. Will that have an impact? These are the things that I think it matters. I think it matters from a perspective of young people being able to see, young women being able to see women in positions of leadership, people of, all of that, being able to see somebody that looks like you and saying, okay, so I think that serves its purpose. But in terms of moving a political agenda or moving forward for more inclusion and diversity of voices, that really depends on the person, right? You can have people who are on the wrong side of issues, even against their own best interests sometimes.
You don't want to necessarily just tick a box for the sake of ticking a box.
Right. For me, when it comes to do I think that we need more women on council? I've said it before. Yeah, we need more feminists on council. Would I prefer that they were women? Absolutely. But I'll take a feminist, for sure.
Interesting perspective. And I'm gonna go through here just October, November, December, and then we'll go through us each, take out what you want to say from it. If you want to pull out a piece of paper right now and write down what you think is the top one out of these next 6, do so. But we'll get through this all, I promise everyone. Thanks for listening. In October, as mentioned, we saw Windsor Police equip the detention unit with naloxone, and we are hoping that by the end of the year, tomorrow, they will have equipped the city center patrol and problem-oriented policing units. We'll check in on that one, though, in early 2021. As mentioned as well, there was the $1.5 billion investment at Fiat Chrysler Automotive for the electrification of their vehicles, moving forward into this new energy future of ours, and the fact that that will be bringing back the third shift. This is all going to be taking place over the next 3 years. So it's been a tumultuous year for sure, especially with just COVID layoffs that have come with it as well in the auto sector, as well as the tool and die and parts sectors. And then in October, we also saw the premier in a COVID-19 omnibus bill kill the ability for municipalities to implement ranked ballots locally. That one stood out for me. We talked about how that seemed like it was was more so aimed directly at the city of Toronto, but it does impact every one of us. And I can think to Mita Williams down here, who is a friend of the show, who was very upset by that announcement. In November, we saw a 6-5 vote of council approving the outsourcing of city hall caretaker jobs. The reason that I wanted to bring this one up, of course, outside of the fact that these 14 jobs were being outsourced, this was not the first time that we saw the potential reduction of jobs this year. In the budget that we talked about for February, only 13 of 35 new positions were funded. And we have here the outsourcing of 14 jobs. So there's this continuing of hollowing out, of not replacing, and of not hiring those that are recommended. So, we might not be holding the line on taxes still, but we are still seeing impacts of not necessarily spending on those core services, on those core people that make up who our municipality workforce is. We also saw the mayor in November breaking COVID-19 protocols and dining out at a fancy restaurant with the CEO of the Tourism Association, TWEPI, down here. That was a big issue. We had the medical officer of health saying that everyone needs to take responsibility after he made that break of COVID-19 rules. Reminds me of an Ann Jarvis column from, I believe, July, where Ann had said that COVID-19 was Mayor Dilkins's finest hour as mayor in terms of how he had acted. And now thinking about that column and how that took place after he had shut down Transit Windsor, it took place after he had been stranded in Jordan. I would like to see the next column that Ann Jarvis writes about whether or not the mayor has continued to act and as this is his finest hour, or if she would reconsider that maybe it was early to consider that. That's a question, though, for another year and for another show. And coming into December, we saw Windsor, Essex, and the whole province following us enter into an extended lockdown period, shuttering retail, shuttering the opportunity for movement, shuttering the ability to see your family and friends over the holidays. I can't think of a more impactful something more impactful just affecting everyone locally. We saw changes to the Conservation Act. We had Councillor McKenzie on the show who spoke about them at length. And then as well, we saw bright light changes implemented throughout the city to huge fanfare. Huge fanfare. People loving what they're seeing. Bright lights spread throughout the communities at a very minimal investment, I will say, for what the outcome has been. And it really raises the question of, hey, if we had spent $3 million at the outset divided throughout all the BIAs, what could this city look like? What could the retail scene look like? What could our sense of community look like? And, would Jackson Park have remained open for, 4 months when it gets shut down throughout the year? So those were a very quick run through of the last months there. There are a few other ones that I didn't get to. But again, we looked through our Rose City politics to put these together. So Doug, I want to know, from what I just went through, from what you just heard, what's your biggest why?
So many interesting issues. The one that is the biggest for me, and partly because this is an issue I'm really interested in, and or at least it relates to an issue I'm really interested in, is the restoration of the third shift at FCA. This is super critical for our community in the short term. That shift coming back is going to be an important shot in the arm. It's we need those jobs. Um, However, I have some concerns because what I have not seen, and this is something I have harped on again and again on this show, I have just not seen a sense of urgency coming out of either the mayor's office or the Economic Development Corporation or any other entity interested in economic change in our community. I don't see the urgency in moving on the diversification file. If anything, we're talking less and doing less than was being done during Mayor Francis's final terms in office. And this concerns me because I truly think that ultimately we see that manufacturing is always going to be part of our economy here in Windsor, Essex. It's always going to be an important part of our economy. Um, but we can see that our standard of living in Windsor, Essex is on the decline. It's been on the decline for some time relative to other communities in Ontario. And partly that's because wages are falling. Wages have fallen in Windsor, Essex. I believe the number is something roughly like 6.5% is the change in the median wage in Windsor, Essex. This has a lot to do with the declining value of labor in manufacturing. Whether or not we keep these jobs or not, they're going to be less valuable 10 years from now. They're going to be less valuable 20 years from now. And to me, it's critically important that we keep our eye on the ball and maintain the good things that we have, but also look to the future and try to understand where we need to be so that the young people coming up today and the generations coming after them will also be able to live in a vibrant community going forward. So for me personally, that's one that sticks out to me. I do think it's important that we're getting those jobs back. And it sounds like there is a substantial investment that should ensure that they are continuing to be here. But think about where we're at with this. We're at a point with manufacturing where there is no dreams of growth. We're not dreaming of growth in our community. We're dreaming of maintaining what we have, and maintaining what we have is a win. That to me spells why we should be looking at diversification more seriously and with a far greater sense of urgency.
Doug, I feel like you are Charlie Brown with Lucy always pulling the football, in the sense of like every time that we've gotten to a chance of having that conversation about diversification, there's been, the shock, use the third shift here in this sense. And then the community rallies and mobilizes, an immense effort is put together to save the thing. And then the thing does get saved, and then everyone forgets about it for another year, another couple years. And then we go through the whole thing over and over again.
Yeah,
And
I think there's some challenges here, and it's not purely, this is not purely like a leadership thing. I think that there is where power lies in our community, and what the perceived interests of the power brokers is. And I think that in a situation like we have here, people don't want to see a lot of change. At least some people don't want to see a lot of change because that would shake up the power dynamics in our community. And also, I think it's the stories that we tell about ourselves, and the narrative and what Windsorites think Windsor is. And so I think it's really challenging. And I'm not trying to understate the level of the challenge. And I don't think that this purely sits on any one elected official or any one bureaucrat to fix on their own. But what frustrates me is that I think that leaders need to be leading this conversation. They need to be helping move this narrative forward. They need to be helping Windsor understand what it means to be a Windsorite in the 21st century, not the 20th century. And that's where I think we're falling short.
thank you for that, Doug. And Manny, let's shift over to you. I want to know, pick up from where Doug left off if you want to, and then your top story as well.
Well, Doug actually stole everything that I was going to say because
Okay, then that's enough. Then we're good.
Because the one thing that stood out for me, as I mentioned off the top, was the loss of 2,000 jobs at FCA. And I don't count the announcement with the electrification of the FCA plant in 2020 because we haven't seen that investment just yet. They've announced the investment, but we haven't seen that. Keeping those 2,000 jobs, maintaining those 2,000 jobs, I think is critical to the local economy. And as I was going to mention, but Doug mentioned it so eloquently, is the diversification of the economy, something that Mayor Dilkins campaigned on in the last municipal election, is diversifying this economy because Windsor is poised, I think, for substantial growth with the construction of the new Gordie Howe International Bridge. We're going to see a new hospital within the next 5 to 10 years here built. But yet, if we lose these 2,000 jobs, manufacturing jobs, something that Windsor is known for, I think that it takes the area and the back. And I think this is a critical step of an untold story that we're going to hopefully see more about in 2021. And I think it's critical that we see more about in the coming year, in the next 12 months. I did I did also make a note of the taxes, because that I thought that was a lost story in 2020 due to the pandemic, John, and I thought that was great that you brought it up. The lockdowns, I don't think in our lifetime, if we talked about that, if we told our kids that, our grandkids, that the whole economy would be shut down, or most of the economy would be shut down because of a pandemic, they wouldn't believe us. I'm wearing a ball cap because I can't get my hair cut. Like it's unbelievable. But I think the one thing that stands out is the newsmaker of the year in locally is Dr. Ahmed. I don't know if you all would agree with that, but if we were picking one newsmaker, it would be Dr. Ahmed for the local region.
I would agree with you on that 100%. You know, we talked about the fight that he went through, but the stress, he's in charge. He's in charge of it all. He's dealing with this every single day. I believe that we're over 100 we're at around 127 deaths so far this year from COVID-19. It's a number that is just staggering to think about from one cause. It really blows me away. Manny, I do want to leave it on this note, though. What do you think about the state of Windsor and how it's going to be covered by media moving into 2021? We've got a lot of big issues that are coming up. They're not going away, and we're going to be under considerable stress here, not only due to COVID, but because of the issues that we're dealing with here locally. Are we well suited to continue covering it? What more needs to be done? What's your take?
Geez, I'm going to be pessimistic with regards to this, because I think the fact that the media landscape continues to change, not for the better. A number of reporters have left their field. A number of reporters have lost their jobs, whether it be print, whether it be television, whether it be radio. I think it will be difficult for the media to continue to stay on the stories and do even more investigative pieces, like the FOI story that we talked about. Reporters are going to need more tips like that to tell more investigative stories, I feel, because I think it's going to be very difficult from a media perspective to cover all of the stories. And as long as this pandemic continues, the pandemic will continue to be the focus, and some of the other stories that are happening in our community will not get as much attention.
So leak to us. Do you have stories about Windsor, Essex? Leak it to us.
Definitely.
We want to know about it.
We're
Pat,
discreet.
Yeah,
discreet
I have a
enough.
bit of I'm a little bit cynical, and I don't know if I'm connecting the right dots here, but and I hear what Manny's saying. I do as well follow, sort of, especially print journalism in particular, and we hear how local news matters and how important it is to our democracy, and yet we're seeing the impacts of what that looks like, and the exactly what makes news and how it makes news. And while I think it's important to have sources who are willing to come forward, as long as the news media, as organizations, they're not so limited in resources that they're basically now going to be tools, if you will. I found that the FOI was planted for a reason. It wasn't, some whistleblower, if you will, that had something interesting to say. I think it was something that was politically spun. And if we go back to it, it was Ann Jarvis, and so I'll stay very specifically to Ann Jarvis, and it goes to a little bit of what Doug mentioned earlier in that exchange with Manny, and that is, Manny, I think you came from, when you take a look at, AIM 800 has never had any problems getting access to the mayor, and I can maybe be a little cynical as to why that is. Very different format, and with due respect to them, a little bit of low balls and a lot of time, and that it's not exactly with hard hitting, and I don't know that that's the kind of journalism that personally I feel is missing, or we were at risk of losing. And so when I take a look at Ann Jarvis's piece, it was John that mentioned and said, what is Ann Jarvis going to say? now about the mayor's performance during COVID, if she factors in, that guffaw of having gone to dinner after. Although we're seeing a lot of politicians, frankly, making the same mistake. Mistake. I don't know if that's the right word, but so it might get clouded in that, right? But having said that, the Windsor Transit was given very short shrift in that, mayor's performance article. And I don't know, I have to think, the fact that there was access to a story, there was a leak. Those partners are working together, if you will. I think it's pretty clear that for the most part, you've got David Mouget and Drew Dilkins on the same side for a lot of political reasons tied together, that I think those things are connected. And I think that, frankly, Ann Jarvis's columns, and she's, how many opinion writers do we have? So how many people do we have providing opinion? It's not only that it's our only sort of local print media on a daily basis or almost daily basis, but it's the one that provides that opinion. And that's a very important piece, short of letters to the editor and, some short segments that we see on AIM 800. Where do we get these opinion pieces besides podcasts, right? So I think that it matters. And I think that we do see a bit of a shift, that you don't, access was given, you don't want access to be taken away. That's just sort of my kind of perspective that I'm seeing on that. John, when I go back to your list, here's one that I found wasn't on, and I don't know how it was missed, but the miracle.
Oh my gosh.
There was a miracle.
There
this
was
year.
there was a
There was a
miracle.
miracle.
June 27th, we did a show about it.
Okay, so can I talk a little bit about that one? And now, because you, so I'll say this because I think a huge story. I know we might wrap up soon, so I'm going to say this before I talk about the miracle. I think a huge story, of course, is anything that is connected to the hospital. I don't think we gave enough time yet. And I don't know if we will. Manny, how long do you have? Thanks for all your time.
I've got all night. Yeah.
Right on. The Wheatsea and that. Like, I hope we talk a little bit about that because I think that's a really important local news story.
I'm pouring a drink
us.
now.
Right on. Why do you think I've been occasionally going off camera? So, but can I just talk about the miracle before we get to those other things? Of course, anybody who's listened to our podcast knows that I think that the location of the hospital is huge. And that's because I think it's a generational decision, very much like I think Doug's focus on diversification for different reasons and with different approaches, but more so I think for the hospital because it really does center around some really key leadership positions in our community that could certainly change the course or better direct the course of that decision. Much more so, diversification is a little more much more complex, actually, frankly, and a much deeper sort of discussion. So for those reasons, but I do draw the comparison that the reason I think those are the issues that are most important, it's because of the long-term impacts to, our communities, our futures, for generations, frankly, and setting the course for that. But getting back to the miracle, I got a little bit of grief. I think I had a moment out there, on social media and it was really closely tied actually. And it was part of the same time that was happening with Dr. Ahmed and the leak. So all of that is connected. I think I even went after the poet laureate at that point. But take a look at the miracle. And here's a really good example of, where at the same time, while I think it's important to be positive and to work towards positive change, those of us that are critics, if you will, of certain things, it's sometimes tough to be that. But I was critical of Miracle, and I'm going to say this, and although it's not going to come through to people who don't want to hear it and are going to be upset by the fact that there's anything critical to say about something like a miracle. And that's the people who worked hard on organizing it. as, with all due respect, misguided as it was. So this is not about the individual people who worked to organize, who really felt good about, the collection of food in our community to redistribute and all of that. Nor is this a criticism of all the people who contributed, the can or whatever it was, or box, went out and shot, whatever they did to contribute to this. But I think that after a few months, and now that it's, it's almost like, is it too soon to be too critical? I don't think it's too soon anymore, because when we take a look at what happened there, here's one, Manny, and you may comment on this maybe. Here's what I think that the media didn't do a good enough story. Like, they bought into, like, this is good and we're part of the, we'll do, whether they were professional press releases or we just see it as being part of a good news story. We need something positive in this community, and we're not going to touch something like there's, we're not going to go there. And yet I think these are real issues that nobody talked about. That, we saw in September, for example, $500,000 flow from the federal government to our food banks that nobody ever questioned. Is that where the need is? And in fact, what was created was this massive logistical nightmare of all this food, first of all, collecting it, which, first of all, kudos to that whole organization. But I can't help but think, wow, what could this community do if we came together and said, we want to tackle a problem and solve it, like a problem that we have. This is not to say that we do not have issue in our community of, food insecurity. What I'm saying is there was no connection between that problem and what this managed to do. And in fact, the warehousing and the distribution, let's face it, they were giving away that stuff. Who knows how much ended up in dumpsters because it expired and they weren't able to redistribute it. Just a couple of months ago, literally in LaSalle, there was like a drive-by in boxes. It's like, anybody come by and take food, right? Like, am I critical because, this could have been just better? No, it comes from the very beginning of what is that we're doing? Why is it? We are caught up sometimes in the things that make us feel good, as opposed to really trying to tackle the very difficult issues. And I think that's true for a lot of the stories that we had this year. We didn't spend a lot of time on it, but going back to Black Lives Matter, to a lot of those issues, we do very superficial things that make us sound like we're doing something when in fact we actually don't. So a little criticism on the miracle once again.
Yeah, no, it's a really good point. I remember the criticism I gave at the time was, it's really good for the bottom line of the grocery stores who weren't expecting to have a bunch of people running in buying stuff. And it goes to your point, Pat, about, is this what was necessary, or would have a cash donation to these organizations really helped to allow them to figure out and allocate where the money's going to? Because you're spending a lot of money on products that have been marked up, and there's profits there that it's not getting directly to the people who needed it. When if you just did a cash donation, purchasing in bulk is something that had an opportunity. Manny, what's your take on that? And then we'll be wrapping up this show. Manny's muted right now, but he's here.
Sorry, I lost my internet connection again. Can you say that again? I'm sorry about that.
So I would actually, Manny, and you don't have to comment on it, but I was talking about the miracle, and
I did hear that.
Yeah, and I'm just wondering, like, is it too much of me to think that there could be more than one angle on a media story, which is digging a little deeper, sometimes asking a hard question, even on what should be and the community wants to be a feel-good story.
I think it's always representative of the media to do that. I just don't think everybody does that. Mm-hmm. And I think in the media landscape, things have become so scarce at times with regards to resources in newsrooms that they're just looking to get the easy story to push out, easy content to push out. And sometimes those difficult questions are not being asked. And I think it basically comes down to that at some point. You mentioned Anne's columns and editorials in print. I know at one point AM 800 did have editorials on the air. They don't do that now. In some cases, TV did do that. Some television stations did do that and provide editorial comments on TV. They don't do that anymore. The focus has changed with regards to the media that way. And sometimes I just don't think they're asking the tough questions.
But do you think that's a risk now that when, and even more so as we head, into the future, and I don't see it necessarily getting any better. It's what you said, and that is that this actually, the risk is that people in positions of powers or with their the ear of media, if you will, being able to feed, being able to write a good press release that will be taken and very easily sort of converted to a story. And so it requires not necessarily a great deal of sophistication, but certainly knowing how to play the game. So when you have an entire marketing team that's designed to get you somewhere, I mean, doesn't this actually it's going to be harder and harder to separate what is really news with what is marketed to us, not to make too many connections to the we can't wait or whatever the hell that campaign is called.
Yeah, I think there is a definite risk that way. And I think we are going to see people who can control the narrative really excel in the current media landscape. People who can write a good press release, or people who can really talk well on camera or on a microphone, or people who've never met a microphone that they didn't like. They're going to really excel in this landscape because they can control the narrative and call up a reporter and say, hey, I've got a great story for you. And the reporter's not going to ask a tough question that way.
Well, and to put a tie in to the beginning, that goes to the anonymous Twitter account that we talked about at the outset. Might be bad for the media and a risk for the media, but it's golden opportunities, I guess, for those who are able to utilize that opportunity for them. It just leaves the community in a pretty big lurch as to figure out what they're listening to, why they're listening to it, and what they should take from it.
Yeah, and I think not only is the job of the media to tell stories of subjects of what people are talking about in their communities, but it's also to challenge the leadership, to get them to explain their decision making and let the public decide for themselves if that's the right way to go or if that's the wrong way to go. And that's why that's why I like the FOI story, because it didn't matter who leaked it. I thought it really gave the public, or at least I hope the public used it as an opportunity to make up their own mind about which road was the best to take during that situation.
It certainly was one of the rare times that the curtain has been pulled back in Windsor, Essex, and we were able to see how the sausage actually gets made, because it's so spoon-fed to us for the most part.
And that's why I think podcasts like this one with Rose City Politics is so important in the community, because the people that do appear on this show, which I've listened to, do challenge the decisions and the decision makers. And I think that's healthy in a media landscape. And I'm afraid we just don't see it enough.
Well, I don't know any better way to end the show but that.
Yeah, I got to agree. That felt about right. Well, for the last time in 2020,
Is it?
This is the last show for 2020. It's the 30th. I didn't think that we were actually going to get to 52 episodes, but we did the whole year. We didn't miss 1 week. You're all welcome. I was gonna swear at you all, but you're welcome. I'm proud of us. We did it. It was a really tough year. Manny, thank you so much for joining us here on our final episode of 2020. Couldn't think of a better co-host to have with us to dive through these issues and to really get to the meat that's still left on the bone with them, so to speak, even though we talked about them before. From Doug, Pat, Don, and myself, Happy New Year, everyone. May 2021 be better than the year of hell that 2020 was. And we look forward to doing this all over again next week. We'll see you on Wednesday.